Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe everyone is in good shape, in good health, sound and safe. So today first of all, we are going to discuss about the principle of curriculum development. It is in chapter 4 of our textbook. This is the first part of a two parts presentation, but first of all, we are going to deal with the first part. The aim of this session is that you will be able to decide how you are going to apply the principles which will encourage the motivated learning process. Some of the pedagogical perspective is to show sensible basis to guide teaching and to help in the design of the course. First of all, we are going to discuss about the principle on content and sequencing. And then we move on to principle on format and presentation. And the last part is principle on monitoring and assessment. In content and sequencing, there are 8 principles. And in format and presentation, we have 10 principles. And in monitoring and assessment, we have only 2 principles. So the content and sequences will be the first part. We are going to discuss 8 principles. They are frequency, strategies and autonomy, space retrieve, language system, keeping moving forward, teachability, learning burden, and interference. We are going to discuss this one by one in more detail in a moment. Before we discuss in detail, let's see the description in brief for each of these 8 principles on content and sequencing. The first one is frequency. Language course should provide the best possible coverage of language in use through the inclusion of items that occur frequently in the language, so that learners get the best return for their learning efforts. So we are going to discuss in detail about this principle. The second one is strategies and autonomy. A language course should train learners in how to learn a language and how to monitor and be aware of their learning so that they can become effective and independent language learners. Basically, we really wish that all the language learners become autonomous. They can learn by themselves so they can improve their language mastery by independently. The third one is space retrieval. So learners should have increasingly spaced, repeated opportunities to retrieve and give attention to wanted items in a variety of contexts. So in terms of vocabulary, structure of the language, and also the formulate expression, for example, we expect that the learners could increasingly improve their mastery in each of those type of items. The fourth one is language system. The language focus of course, needs to be on generalizable features of the language. So which kind of language items should be focused on? That will be very important in this principle. The next one is keep moving forward. So a language course should progressively cover useful language items, skill, and strategies. So the gradation of the content of the language items that should be taught should be this should be considered carefully in order the students can progress from the simple one to more complicated language items. The sixth one is teachability. So this is an important principle. If the items is developed, but then it is not able to be taught by the teacher, then it is not a good item. So the teaching of language items should take account of the most preferable sequencing of these items and should take account of when the learners are most ready to learn them. So there are some conditions by which the items can be taught most effectively. So it should be considered well. Number 7 is learning burden. So the course should help learners make the most effective use of previous knowledge. So the items, the volume of the content should be a bit by bit, which can be learned effectively by the learners one item at a time. So one pieces of item at one time before moving on to the next item. And interference. The item in a language course should be sequenced so that items which are learned together have a positive effect on each other for learning and so that interference effects are avoided. So items that are taught one by one should be supporting and supplementary one another, which build up the mastery of the language by the learners, not to interfere one item with another. So this is an important principle in the format, in the content and sequencing. So now we come to the first principle, frequency, in terms of content and sequencing. Just now we read about the description of this principle. A language course should provide the best possible coverage of language. So the items that we should include in the course in use through the inclusion of items that occur frequently in the language so that learners get the best return for their learning effort. So we consider first the high frequency items. For example, the words we can consider the most frequently occur in the daily conversation, in the daily life. Then that will have a large proportion of our text, of course. But then we also have to consider the low frequency item because they will also find them in their text. So they have to learn also the low frequency items. For example, in terms of grammar, when you are talking about the conditional sentences, probably they do not occur very frequently, but then they may learn it in the text that they are reading. So you have to include also in your course book. Typically, high frequency items are simple in their form, but not necessarily in their meaning. So for example, we are talking about the word sweet. Sweet is a simple word and high frequently occur in our daily life. But then the meaning may differ from one context to another. You may say sweet in terms of taste, sweet. But then when you say in terms of food or diet, it may may have different meaning. When you say sweet, they are not a good diet if you eat sweet, including chocolate, donuts, and so forth. And then maybe say sweet home, sweetheart, and so forth. And the meaning may differ depending on the context where the word is used. The word is really simple and high frequently words, but then the meaning may differ from one context to another. So we have to pay attention to that kind of items in our course. Next, the second principle, strategies and autonomy. We see the definition, description of the strategy just now. It is a language course should train learners in how to learn a language, strategy, how to learn the language, so that they can become effective and independent language learners. Basically, the teachers and the instructor wants the student to be autonomous in learning. They can learn independently and they can improve their mastery in the language by themselves on their own. But that is a long process. How we implant, how we teach them strategies in order they become an autonomous learner. So relate to learner goal, the language learning process, task learning strategies, reflection on learning. They are all strategies that might be good, that lead them to autonomous learners. So different kind of learning strategies. The first one, for example, deep processing of language and content. How are you going to present? Do you want them to only repeat, to drill the words, the pronunciation, the meaning in Bahasa Indonesia and so forth? And that is not a kind of deep processing. If you want them to master the word, you may want them to create their own mnemonic, the way to remember the words and the meaning of the words by creating their own ways of remembering or putting the words into the long-term memory. So that is what we call the deep processing. You may drill them to fluently pronounce the word correctly in what we call the drilling, but then that is not a deep processing. When you are doing this, for example, you are teaching them about the word parts. So when they have the word dick, D-I-C-T, for example, that is the root of the words, then every word that has this root will have the meaning which is similar to one another because they come from the same root. So what we call the word part strategies, or probably mnemonic is what I mentioned just now. They create their own mnemonic and then they can remember the words well. They can put the words into their long-term memory because they process the word themselves by creating mnemonic, or probably predicting and note-taking strategies. These are all what we call the deep processing of language and content. Now we come to the third principle, space retrieved. So we read the definition or description of this principle just now. Learners should have increasingly spaced, repeated opportunity to give attention to wanted items in a variety of contexts. So we want them to learn specific language items, and then we try to present this language item in different time, and then they have a repeated opportunity, more opportunity, not only once, to repeat that items, and then they finally can master the items. So this is what we call the space retrieve. You may present this in the beginning of the lesson at the day, and then in the middle of the lesson, then you try to repeat, to review again the item, and probably to the end, by the end of the lesson of the day, then you once again try to review the same item. So this means the space retrieve. And probably in the following meetings, in the following class, you again review the same item. So this kind of repetition will make them learn the items very well. The mastery of the items will be very well. So by this repetition, that will become a kind of higher level of processing. When the more you rehearse about an item, then the more likely that you can store the item in long-term memory and you can easily retrieve later when you need it. Usually what is the small group or language item that might be drilled this way. So what we call the core, the core rule of the language, it is which consists of not too many, can be doing by using this space retrieve, because this kind of rule will be used again and again in the later lesson of the course. Principle number 4, language system. This is the core of the selection of content. So the items that you are going to include in your course. The language focus of a course needs to be generalizable features of the language system. The regular language features, the grammatical items, the rules, when you pronounce the words, and then you may find out the regularity of the pronunciation. You may say that you have the rule for pronounce the words like make, take, say, hate, that, and so on. So there is a regularity, and that might be a good choice that you will be including in your course. We call it regular because it may be one of the specific characteristics of the language, the creativity of the language. You know that the what is the suffix er, like read, reader, write, writer, hate, hater, and this all called the creative use of the language because it's regular one. You can add the suffix to form an agent of a noun. There's the frequency of vocabulary. You may check out in the internet the high frequency word list, for example, from the everyday language to the academic word list. And then the word meaning. So what is the meaning of language? This is what I mean just now, the underlying meaning, concept like sweets, so sweet taste, sweet music, sweet smile, and other kind of sweet in conjunction with another word every time you use a different word after the sweet, then the meaning, the underlying meaning may differ. So you have to be careful about selecting this kind of vocabulary words. And then word parts. Yeah, just now I mentioned about the suffix. For example, why, stone, stony, wind, windy, sand, sandy. So this kind of parts is good to include because it will make the learner aware of how the language works. And then the structure, of course, is the important part. And then the scores, topic type, what type of topic that might be important to include, and of course, rhetorical structure, cohesive devices. This is when you are talking about this course, the larger chunks of the language that the student may want to learn too, you have to include in your course. Now we come to principle number 5, keep moving forward. So a language course should progressively cover useful language items, skills, and strategies. So in sequencing the content that you have selected, you should consider this should go from one item to another progressively and cover all the useful language items, including skills and strategies. So explicit, achievable language teaching goals. Each learning test has a goal, apply variety of teaching method, and regular goal directed test. So every time in every meeting or in every class, then you have some specific task that has goal. So all the tests that you have created, you have designed and developed in your course should always aim at the goal that you have stated in the beginning of the course development. So achievable language teaching goals, meaning that the goals that you have stated in the beginning should be achieved, not too broad, not too difficult to achieve, but then by doing some kind of activities, then the learner will achieve the goal. By applying specific method and strategy, then you believe that the goal will be achieved by the learners. And then in order you are sure that the goal has been achieved, then you will always develop a kind of test or an assessment tool in order that you can justify that the goal has been achieved. So we call it here a regular goal directed test. You always try to assess the achievement of the goal at the time. So in every meeting, you develop an assessment or a kind of an evaluation tool in order that you can ensure yourself that the goal for the day has been achieved by administering the test you have developed. We call it goal-directed test. So the test will always refer to the goal. The goal will lead you to design the test which will measure the goal. Principle number 6, teachability. I believe that you understand well what we mean by teachability. The ability that the teacher will be able to carry out the material and the student will be able to learn this material. So the teaching of language items should take account of the most favorable sequencing of these items and should take account of when the learners are most ready to learn them. So you may consider that an item may become the basis for achieving the next item. Without achieving the first one, it is impossible for the learners to achieve the second one. So this kind of hierarchical sequencing of items should be considered. So for example, the student will not be able to write a sentence if they don't understand the part of the sentences, subject and predicate. And then they have to understand the subject will most of the time consist of noun or noun phrase. So they should understand what noun or noun phrase is in order that they can put this noun and noun phrase in the subject position in the sentence. And so for this kind of sequencing, we call it teachability, should be considered well because it is impossible to learn an item if it has some kind of prerequisite. A prerequisite is that the one that should know first before we know the other. So it is very important to have in the sequencing of the content. So a sequence list of structure. So which kind of structural item should come first and then which item will come next. Arrangement, initial to final, final to initial, internal to final, final to internal. So this can be seen in table 4.2 in 4.2 in our textbook, the order of acquisition. This order of acquisition has been studied by a lot of researchers, and then we can be sure that this type of order of acquisition may help us in sequencing the content of our course. This is the table from the textbook, table 4.2, the structures in order of acquisition. So researchers have listed this when the children of English as a first language, their first language, then also in researchers of the English as second language, they found that these are the order of acquisition of the structure of the English. So single word formulae, for example, how are you, nice to see you, and so forth. So they acquire this first before they can, for example, find out the order of the word in the sentences, the subject, verb, and object, subject, verb, and object. So the tea is hot, for example. Is the tea hot? If it is a question then. But then this will very helpful for us when we have selected the content and we try to order, to sequence which one will come first and then which ones will come next. Principle number 7 is learning burden. You know what we mean by burden. So this will refer to the teacher and the learner, of course. The learning burden should be considered about the teacher and also the learners. So the course should help the learners to make the most effective use of previous knowledge. This is very important when I mentioned just now about the hierarchical sequence of the items. So we believe that when we try to present a new item, And then we know that when the learners use their previous knowledge, they will be able to acquire the new item because they already have some kind of background knowledge which can be used to process the information, and then finally they will achieve and master the new item. As long as the new item is not too much in volume, so according to Krashen, it's only I plus 1. So comprehensible input, they have the background knowledge, they already know about something, and then you add new item, only one, not too many, so one item at a time. We believe that they will be able to master this new item as long as it's not too far away from what they already know. For example, the pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, and discourse. So always remember that the progression of the language items is not in large chunks, but should be bit by bit, according to this the principle by Krashen. So it's 1I plus 1. So we always present only one new item at a time. So the mastery of vocabulary, when they have the background knowledge, when they have the reading test, they have some kind of information about sports, for example, football game. And then there's some background knowledge about the football game. And then we believe that when they encounter vocabulary which are new for them in that topic, they may be able to guess intelligently about the meaning of the words because they have background knowledge in that area, for example, in sports. So this is very important principle about language burden. Remember that the volume for one presentation is not too much. The burden will be very heavy, and that will be very hard for them to master the new item. The last principle on this content and sequencing part is interference. So the items in a language course should be sequenced so that items which are learned together have a positive effect on each other for learning. There is no interference effect, and it should be avoided. So when you present items of the language all together, then we believe that this language item will not interfere one another. So be careful when you present the items all together simultaneously. Consider about the effect of interference. We have to avoid this. Strong meaning relationship, opposite near synonym, pre-associate, interfere with each other. Should they be learned at the same time? When you include vocabulary words and then you want them to do exercise on the vocabulary items using synonym, antonym, free associates, or probably description of the meaning, definition of the meaning of the words, then maybe you would like to present one by one, not to put it in a table and then they will at once find out the what is the definition, the opposite, the synonym, and a different kind of meaning related of the words. So be careful with the possibility of interference that we should avoid. So these are the 8 principles in content and sequences. There are 8 principles. You have to consider them very well, read carefully once again, and try to understand each of these principles and consider which one probably important, which one is more important than the others. All of them are important, but probably you will not be able to put into practice all the 8 principles altogether when you consider your course. Before we move on to the second part of this class, of this lesson, you may want to stop a while and do this assignment. So before we proceed to the next 10 principle on format and presentation and 2 principle on monitoring and assessment, you have to do the following assignment. You have some time to do this. Select one principle that you consider most important. So out of the 8, we have discussed 8, and then read carefully one by one, and then consider and justify one of the most important one according to in your opinion, which one is the most important one. And then explain what this principle is and explain why they are important, why it is important. It's only one, why it is important. So you may write in English or in Indonesian. So you may choose whether you write your answer in Indonesian or in English. So now you have, you may want to work on this before you see the next video lesson. Thank you. Thank you. Now you are on your own to do the assignment, and I'm looking forward to seeing your work on the Google Classroom. Thank you. I'll see you in the next meeting.